Now, Ukraine's President Zelensky has called Wednesday's Russian airstrike on a children's hospital and maternity ward in Mariúpol an atrocity. Now, this attack and the chilling scenes from its aftermath can only increase pressure on Western allies to help Ukraine. On Wednesday, the EU added 160 more Russian oligarchs to its blacklist as it tightened sanctions. But despite Zelensky's pleas, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said that fighter jets will not be part of the assistance Germany is providing. And he maintained that diplomacy is needed to resolve the conflict.
It doesn't make sense to resolve this conflict militarily. What we need now is a diplomatic solution, and that's what we're striving for in coordination with our international partners. We hope the discussions between Ukraine and Russia will yield solutions, and that we can find a way to help us get out of this situation.
In Washington, that commitment to keeping up diplomatic and economic pressure was echoed by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
I'm convinced that we will see a strategic defeat of President Putin and the propositions he's put forward. We'll accomplish this by backing Ukrainians in their fight, by remaining united in holding Russia accountable through the devastating sanctions, the diplomatic isolation, and other measures. And we've already seen that Russia's failed in its chief objectives. It's not been able to hold Ukraine. It's not going to be able to hold Ukraine in the long term, again, no matter what the tactical victories it may achieve are.
A discussion among Western allies over how to indirectly provide Ukraine with fighter jets has been overshadowed by concerns that any overt military support could raise the risk of a wider conflict. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg cautioning against anything that could escalate the war.
NATO has a responsibility to ensure that this conflict does not escalate beyond Ukraine, because this would be even more dangerous, destructive and deadly for Ukraine and for all of us.
And I'm pleased to be joined now by Wesley Clark. He is a retired four-star general of the U.S. Army and former NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. A very warm welcome to the day, sir. 23 years ago, in March 1999, NATO, under your command, intervened in Kosovo. When you look at the refugees fleeing Ukraine, when you look at these long lines arriving in Germany, in Poland, does that bring back memories from those times?
Yes, it does.
Back then in Kosovo, NATO intervened. Now in Ukraine, as we've heard, NATO saying that it's best to stay out. How do you explain that to a Ukrainian family that is hiding in a bomb shelter?
It's inexplicable to the Ukrainian family in a bomb shelter. I understand what the NATO Secretary General is saying. He's a superb leader, and he's done an excellent job with NATO. But the truth is that NATO has to come to terms, and the United States has to come to terms with the implications of what this aggression means by Russia directed against Ukraine. Any negotiations will be determined by the outcome on the ground. The outcome on the ground is determined by the resistance of the Ukrainians. The Russians have proven themselves a relatively inept force. And I would remind all of our European listeners that escalation by Mr. Putin is not solely under the control of NATO. No matter what NATO does or doesn't do, Mr. Putin may decide to escalate. So it's imperative that we sustain the Ukrainian forces in the fight. The Russian forces are defeatable on the battlefield, and even if they aren't, as Secretary Blinken has said, Russia can face a strategic defeat over the midterm from this.
And what does that actually look like in practical terms, sustaining Ukrainian forces?
That means providing them javelins, stingers, and as much anti-air and air support as is feasible to do.
So do you support a no-fly zone in Ukraine?
No, you can't do a no-fly zone because legally, all the aficionados who think they know everything about air power say you can't do it legally. It could have been done before Russia attacked. But at that point, the nations of the world were not ready to believe that Russia would attack. Now it's not possible to do a legalistic no-fly zone. However, air support can be provided by nations who are willing to go in. This airspace does not belong to Russia. I want to remind your listeners that this is Ukrainian airspace, and it's the president of Ukraine appealing for international support. So nations should think about this. If their nation is under assault, they want international support. It's their nation. So I give a lot of credence and a lot of credit to President Zelensky. He's proved to be a very courageous leader, and I think the nations of the West have to find ways to support Ukraine.
But by NATO sending in air power, that would mean U.S. aircraft would need to be ready to shoot down Russian planes.
I'm not going to get into the dispute about whether U.S. aircraft shoot down Russian planes, wave at Russian planes, or avoid Russian planes. This is for the President of the United States and the official leaders to decide upon and determine how to proceed. What I will say is that the future of the West is determined in large part by what happens in this conflict in Ukraine. It is in the interest of every country in the West to support Ukraine on the ground. How we're doing that, that's up to the leadership. And there's no point in someone like me who doesn't have access to the real-time intelligence trying to prescribe a military plan to military leaders who are under national political authorities. They have to know how to do that. When I was in uniform, I did.
But surely sending in air power, I just want to come back to this point, that would mean conflict. I mean, it would mean that the United States and NATO allies would have to be ready to go head-to-head with Russian planes, and surely that would be an escalation that could lead to Putin, who has put his nuclear forces on high alert, to come back in a way that it's no exaggeration, could lead to World War III.
Well, let me ask you this question. If after Putin has digested Ukraine, he decides that he wants to finish his political objective by rolling NATO back out of the other countries of Eastern Europe who are now hosting NATO troops, do we at that point say, oh, my goodness, since you might have nuclear weapons against us, we'll surrender? What do we do then?
How likely do you think that would be, that he would invade NATO allied countries?
You and our national leaders have to realize this. Putin's objectives are not limited to Ukraine. This is about rolling back the westernization, the rule of law, the international order in Europe and the rest of the world. This is simply the first battle. It is the easiest of the battles to fight if our nations are unified and can face reality in this. If we fall back and are intimidated by Mr. Putin's threat of nuclear weapons, if there's nothing we can do to help Ukraine, then we'll be dealing with the next crisis on NATO's territory itself.
So what do you think Mr. Putin has in his sights? Are we talking about NATO allied states that you think he would intervene in?
Certainly. If you talk to the nations in Eastern Europe, they'll tell you precisely what their fears are. Mm-hmm. From as long as I've dealt with the Russians in the post-Cold War period, they've always believed that the Baltic states belong to them.
And so does that then think that...
Moldova
do you think that Russia is currently winning on the ground in Ukraine?
Russia's not winning on the ground. It's right now checkmated on the ground, or at least checked on the ground by poor logistics, communications, and the stiff resistance of the Ukrainians.
Do you expect that to change?
Yet, but it could change. The Russians have no regard for civilian casualties. They do have a lot of heavy firepower, and they do have an air force that could be more deeply engaged. Today, they're bombing civilian targets in Mariúpol. I'm convinced Mr. Putin's got an eye on the International Criminal Court. He's trying to steal Ukraine as quietly and quickly as he can using the threat of nuclear weapons, but he will use massive firepower if necessary. So
it's clearly not going quietly. I want to ask you how surprised you were by the determination of Ukraine's army and its citizens in pushing back against this invasion.
I wasn't surprised by the Ukraine's determination or their army's effectiveness. I've been over there many years. However, I will tell you this. I was surprised by the ineffectiveness of the Russian military.
All right. That was retired U.S. General Wesley Clark. I want to thank you so much, sir, for joining me here on The Day.
Thank you very much. Good interview. Thank you.
We go now, we'd like to turn now to Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He's a retired U.S. Army officer and the former commander of U.S. forces in Europe, and he joins us from Frankfurt, Germany. A very good day, sir. So good of you to make some time out to speak to us. Why is sending weapons into Ukraine acceptable, but sending fighter jets untenable, according to the Pentagon?
Yeah, I completely disagree with this decision. by the Pentagon or the announcement, if that's the case. I'm not sure that the book is closed on this. I love the initiative by Poland to give capability that Ukrainians need so they can defend themselves. I'm sure it's more complicated underneath than it seems, and that I'm willing to bet that we're going to eventually get there. But to the point of your question, I would not make the difference that, providing aircraft is bad, but providing Javelin is good or acceptable. So I hope that we get this fixed very quickly.
Would you be in favor of NATO intervening or enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, as the Ukrainians have been pleading NATO to do?
Well, for sure, we cannot repeat what we did at Srebrenica in 1995, where European soldiers under a UN mandate stood outside the city while 8,000 Bosnian men and boys were murdered by Republika Srpska forces. So we can't do that. We're watching deliberate murder of Ukrainian citizens every single day because they're being targeted by Russian forces. Still, this is not inconsequential. If NATO gets inside Ukrainian airspace and on the ground in Ukraine, that potentially changes the nature of what's going on here. For sure, NATO air forces would destroy Russian air forces, but the bigger point is, what are the implications? And we want to preserve the unity of the alliance. So this is not a decision to be taken alone by the United States. I do think it's worth considering, though. Most of the damage that's being done in the cities is not by the Russian Air Force. It's being done by systems on the ground, missiles, rockets, artillery, fired from Russian units inside Ukraine and also inside Russia, and by the Black Sea Fleet. What can we do to help Ukraine destroy those? Anti-ship capability, more intelligence, longer range systems where Ukrainians could destroy the source of this damage.
So how long do you think that Ukraine's army could withstand this Russian onslaught? Do you think that the longer this war goes on, the harder it will be for Russia to win it, or the more difficult it will be for Ukraine to stand its ground?
No, absolutely. Ukraine is going to win this. Russia is not going to get into Kyiv. Russia has made the decision to transition to attrition warfare. And to do that, you have to have time, you have to have unlimited ammunition, and you have to have unlimited manpower. And Russia has none of those three. The sanctions are going to begin to take real effect in the next few weeks, and that's going to affect their time as well as their population. They do not have unlimited ammunition. We're already hearing reports of shortages of some key munitions. Again, sanctions help here. And they have a manpower problem. They've already stopped the departure of some troops who are due to end their conscription, and they're trying to recruit mercenaries from Syria. So this manpower problem is big for them, whereas the logistical effort from the West for Ukraine is only just now picking up speed. So I think actually time is on the side of Ukraine.
But the Ukrainians are outgunned and outnumbered. I mean, how can they possibly win this?
Actually, they're not outnumbered. There's more than 200,000 troops in Ukraine's land forces, and then you've got a very large territorial force. And then we've seen very clearly that the Ukrainian population is willing to fight, to do things. Russia does not have that many soldiers inside Ukraine. So they're not outnumbered. Clearly, the Russians have the advantage from sea power and, at this point, air power, but they have not demonstrated the overwhelming air power superiority that, frankly, I would have expected. So I think that in this case, because the logistics is going to is improving for the Ukrainians, and it only gets more difficult for the Russians, I think that Ukraine, as long as the West sticks together and continues to support, I think Ukraine has a chance to come out of this on the right side.
And in conclusion, sir, I just want to ask you, should the U.S. engage with Russia? Should the U.S. engage directly with the Kremlin to stop this bloodshed?
Well, here's what we should be doing. On April the 1st, 1 April, 130,000 young Russian men, 19 and 20 years old, have to report for duty at conscription centers. This is the scheduled next wave of conscription. That means 130,000 families are about to send their son and brother off to become cannon fodder as privates in the Russian army to fight in a war of Slavs against Slavs. I think if we could somehow reach even a third of those families and that they refuse to send their son to conscription, that would be like an earthquake inside Russia. And this is what we need, is pressure, organic pressure from inside Russia. This is how this comes to a conclusion.
Retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former commander of U.S. forces in Europe. Sir, thank you for your time.
Thank you for the privilege.